So my name is Chris Wahl. I'm at Chris Wahl on the Twitters. That's all I'll say about myself. Today we're going to talk about, the title is very detailed here, networking. We're talking about networking. That has been further defined to software-defined networking and traditional. So we're going to kind of ignore that because that doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. But real quick, let's introduce our wonderful panelists. You guys and gals are really in for a treat because these are definitely captains and leaders of industry in the networking space. So it'll be a very exciting conversation. So Joe, why don't you tell us who you are, who you work for, what do you do?
So I am Joe Onisick. I am a principal engineer on the INSBU team at Cisco Systems. So I'm responsible for the Cisco ACI and Nexus 9000 product lines from a technical perspective.
Okay, Lisa?
I'm Lisa Caywood. I'm a product marketing manager at Brocade, focusing on hippie open source stuff.
Hippie open source stuff, all right.
I'm Tom Hollingsworth. I'm an organizer on the Tech Field Day event series and a networking blogger in my copious amounts of free time.
Yeah, your boss is here. You should probably be saying that.
No free time. Ryan Hughes, Senior Solution Architect for Presidio Network Solutions out of Atlanta, Georgia. Focused mostly on software-defined networking.
And Mr. Lowe.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Scott Lowe. I work in the CTO's office for the Network and Security Business Unit at VMware, focusing on NSX and related open source projects.
Okay, so as you have heard, we have a pretty wide gamut of different vendors represented, different industries that I think we can talk about, different verticals. So I want to just open up with a real basic question. We'll start with Joe and kind of work our way down. I'd like to get everyone's input on this particular question. But over the last 2-3 years, being where I'm kind of sitting outside the bubble for the most part, I don't really do day-to-day networking, but it seems like there's a lot of things going on in networking, a lot of change, disruption, whatever marketing buzzword you want to use. What would you attribute some of these changes to? What are some of the challenges we're trying to solve? Just kind of pontificate a little bit around what we're trying to do and change in the data center. Joe. Nice hardball there.
That's a hardball, yeah.
Yeah.
So is it the what or the why? Do you want the catalyst or what we're actually trying to change?
Let's start with the catalyst.
The catalyst is a gentleman named Martin Casado. Your network will be better over the next 10 years, regardless of what network you choose. The responsibility for that falls with a gentleman named Martin Casado. He had an idea that our networks were broken. He proved that idea, and he proved that idea for $1.2 billion. He built an industry. SDN, that's where it comes from. The catalyst for change is that our networks are way too complex and way too slow to change. They're way too slow to adapt to where you're going today, way too slow to take on the way you need to deliver applications and services today.
I think that's a good way to put that. $1.2 billion definitely proves a point, I would say. I guess, Lisa, do you want to add to some of that?
No, I have nothing to add.
All right, cool. Even with the hippie open source stuff? Come on.
No, I mean, the open source angle, I think, is interesting in that, Nicira kicked things off, definitely. I think that open source is increasingly sort of eating everything else that we do. It's not just eating networking, it's eating orchestration, it's eating all of these other things. And so that's, I think, adding an extra sort of zing to the whole proceedings. If we were going along in the traditional ways that we have always done things from a vendor perspective, where we iterate product cycles and so forth and so on, we would not be seeing the rate of change that we're seeing now. And so that is causing a lot of churn and turmoil on the vendor side, as much as it is, as much as it is on the user side. And so, the good news is we're all figuring this out together. The bad news is we all have to figure this out together. So.
Tom, just based off what Lisa was saying, I was wondering if we could also go a little deeper into open source as it pertains to networking. In your mind, is that white box switching? Is that things like Cumulus and Big Switch and their products they're bringing to market? Or is that more on how we're managing the network?
I think it's a little bit of both, actually. Network management for a lot of years has been kind of, it's been driven by an open source idea where we build a tool to fix a problem we have right now. And then we kind of expand on it, and then you have Nagios and other things which have become this lumbering beast. But at the same time, you've got, you mentioned Cumulus, you mentioned Big Switch, there's also Pluribus Networks and a host of other people out there that are basically saying, why does the network operating system have to live on one piece of hardware? Why can't it live on multiple pieces of hardware? And let's face it, with the exception of a couple of companies like Joe's, Most everybody else buys their switches from an ODM somewhere. Well, if all the switches come from an ODM and they all run different OS when they get shipped to the US, why are we paying the middleman to install an operating system? Why can't we do that ourselves? And I think you're going to start seeing innovation driving there. There are obviously some hurdles that you have to get past that have been solved traditionally in hardware. But once you get past that point, the sky's the limit.
That's good points. Very good points. Ryan, I'm curious your thoughts as we're seeing all these changes occurring.
Yeah, I think I'm similar boat to you, Chris, where, sitting outside, not being directly involved in some of the product direction, but, dealing more with the customer side. I think, there's a frustration on the customer perspective where, they're tired of waiting for the next release to, fix certain issues or things like that. So I think, I definitely think open source customers are embracing it more as an overall strategy, just because they're tired of being tied to somebody else's, especially from a deployment aspect. If I need to get a feature out there sooner, I'm going to, take that under my wing and just deploy it out there. Okay. And I think what I see, from the disruptiveness of something like Cumulus, where it's going to change things for the better for the rest of us. I don't necessarily know that everyone's going to adopt Cumulus, but I think it's making other people reconsider how, how they're approaching problems today.
So to Ryan's point, he brought up that customers would be hopefully people in this room. Pain point is waiting for new code and probably the situation around deploying new code, bugs, patches, having to work. Is that an issue for anyone in this room? Is he hitting the mark on that? We just have a lot of tired people.
There better be more hands.
Come on. Only 2 people in this whole room have any problems with their network. Okay.
Oh, they're all server people.
Okay, that's a problem.
It's just broken.
So then, okay, that's a good comment. Scott, let's talk about that. We have a bunch of server people in the room. We're talking networking. I guess, where do you see those lines blurring that kind of ties back into these changes that are occurring? I thought you might be the right person to perhaps answer that question.
Well, there's everybody has had incredible points thus far. I mean, that's kind of the valid, the value of being the last guy, because I can just say, well, they were all right, and honestly, they were. I mean, it's absolutely correct. The networking industry has been due for a change. There's a lot of forces contributing to that. We have open source moving in, as Lisa pointed out, which is not only creating new products, but also forcing existing products to change. We have people like Martin and others who are inventing new models of how networking is done. We have customers who are under pressure to deliver more fluid environments, the cloud, et cetera, et cetera. We have projects like OpenStack coming in to provide open source orchestration. So all these things coming together, it's a very interesting time to be in the space. As far as servers and networking, I mean, the reality is that the vast majority of workloads in most of, I'll call on you guys to validate, but I mean, most of you guys, I would say greater than half of your data centers are probably virtualized now. Would that be a fair assessment, right? Yeah, okay.
Get some nods, we got hands, yep. Okay.
Yeah, some people agree, that's fine. Some people still sleep, that's okay. And so what you really need is you need to find there's 2 things you need to find. One is the right sweet spot of where to put some of this stuff, and you want to get as granular as possible, so generally you want to get close to the application. So that being the case, the hypervisor makes a lot of sense to put that endpoint, right? And then you need some way of aggregating all this network state together rather than having it scattered across all these different pieces of equipment. So there's a lot of different directions going on here, but I think the guys and gals who have been in virtualization are in a really, kind of a nice spot, so to speak, because the hypervisor becomes a very natural place for things like that to land.
Fair enough. Yeah. And we also got an audience question that I get to read, because that's my prerogative. And it was, I thought it was good, and I think you'll enjoy it. So it's around software-defined networking. And it's basically, why should I care and how is it going to change my life? So does that sound pertinent to y'all as server folks? Hands up, yes? Cool. Okay, so I'm very curious how you feel software-defined networking will or will not change your life and is or is not important. Tom, you raised your hand.
I'll start with
first victim.
Yes. It's actually from a talk that David Meyer gave, David Meyer of Brocade and also the Open Daylight Project. We've had networks that have been accelerating in speeds for a decade. 10 meg, 100 meg, gig, 10 gig, 40 gig, terabit, however fast you want to get. But we're
ludicrous
still
speed, going to plaid.
Going to plaid, exactly. But they're still manually operated. So it's like driving a bullet train with a guy at the steering wheel going 400 miles an hour going, okay, turn. You're going to mess up. And networks are inherently frail. Well, the problem is that no matter how much management and things you add in there, there's always going to be that human element. It's always going to be some junior admin programming VLANs. And when you fat finger a VLAN at a terabit core service provider network, yeah, that's how Facebook goes offline, and that's when you get lots of
Or when
angry
you
emails.
exceed like 512,000 routes on your switch, that kind of thing.
Totally different thing.
Wow.
But
So everyone's up to date on current events, right? Yeah,
But one of the things that SDN is going to help us with is the ability to automate those changes, to add a higher order of intelligence into networking so that those changes can happen automatically from a guy sitting there scratching his head at the console going, okay, I need that VM to talk to this VM, and I need it to go through that firewall in order to get there for compliance purposes. Nowadays, that requires the networking team to go talk to the security team has to work their black magic, and things just have to work. Now, with things like OpFlex or NSX, I can just say, go here and go there and go here, and it takes care of that. And that reduces the amount of fragility in the network, and there's a check and balance system in place to keep me from blowing things up. Oh, you're going to force 400 megabits of traffic through a firewall that can only handle 10 megabits? Good luck with that.
Joe, you're itching over here. Please, fire away.
I am.
He's fidgeting.
He knows me well enough. So I look at it, it's 2014, you're in San Francisco. To get from San Francisco to Silicon Valley, you'll take the 101. On the 101, there's a good chance you will drive a car that is driving itself with no human inside. In the Middle East right now, there are planes flying around taking photographs, and there's no pilot inside, and there's a 21-year-old kid in Arizona with a remote control making that happen. In your data center, there is a person on a command line typing in complex commands to move the data that does what you do. We have not kept up. We do need a change. SDN does need to move. And I think, yes, SDN will help you. We got to get it right. You got to pick the right place, and you got to pick the business drivers that are going to do that for you.
He's a great voiceover guy, don't you think? So I actually have two. I'm going to respond with, there's sort of two different vectors for me.
By all means.
So first, from the technical perspective, so I entered the networking world through the security door.
So you're the person no one liked.
Lovely, so.
But to me, I came in and I was supposed to promote the original SDN, the self-defending network.
Oh.
And I went around to all the
SDN.
various product teams within that BU, and they all told me that they what they did, and it all sounded exactly the same because that's what they said they did. But none of them, because each had their own individual management console, none of those different products could even talk to each other, never mind anything else. And I'm like, well, so how do you have an end-to-end self-defending network if your management platforms can't even talk to each other and can't share policy? That doesn't make any sense. And so I've always kind of gravitated towards that sort of unified field strategy or field theory of management, and security is sort of the other half of the coin on that. And I think that's really where the new SDN takes us, is that ability to unify policy without necessarily a really hard-coded centralized model, which again doesn't necessarily scale. So I think that's one piece of it. The other is, I think, from a market perspective, the fact that somebody broke open the mental box and said, it doesn't have to be vertically integrated. We can take this one layer here and we can do lots of different things with it. That's broken everything else apart. So it's not just about the controller. There's the white box model with Cumulus that you were talking about. There are people who sort of conflate orchestration with controllers, and it's kind of fuzzy as to exactly where that line is. And it's all kind of coming together, but because there's so much confusion, that's allowing for a lot of innovation, because there isn't a box that people have to sit within. And so I think that just that confusion, if we let it ride out, that's going to bring us to a lot of really cool things over the next few years.
Well, I think part of the problem there is that so many vendors in the last couple of years have tried to argue that whatever solution they had in place before the SDN wave hit was SDN if you look at it from a certain point of view.
Yeah.
Now, Ivan Pepelniak even said it. He's like, we were doing SDN with dial-up networks, using radius to pass authentication back to a user. That's technically SDN. And I was sitting there at my computer pulling my hair out. Because while you are technically correct, yeah.
Yeah, that's not a good thing.
I'm sick of vendors saying, hey, we had SDN 3 years ago. No, you didn't. You had a platform. You thought it was doing software stuff, but now all of a sudden, orchestration, automation, programmability, those do not SDN make.
All I need is a sticker that says now with SDN. I throw it on the same box, sell it to you. It's good.
I think I bought one of those from you the other day.
You did.
Well, I think there's a big point though. I think forever, manufacturers have sold to customers with features, and so often those in a network, architecture role have taken out almost all those features to make the network resilient and scalable and actually work. So there's like counterintuitive, technology premises going on here. So I mean, any of us who spent from my perspective, I spent 5 years supporting an enterprise network where we would get sold on a solution, we'd try it out, it didn't work, we'd still deploy it out without it. So I think what I see going on from like an open source community is the users are really pushing back to get the control because they do want some of those features. But I think there's a lot of trust and a lot of work that's going to be going into that so that they can actually grab that stuff, because I think the requirements are definitely there, especially from a security aspect. I mean, you look at common network designs to implement security, it can get very convoluted very quickly. So we have to break the model that we've been supporting for like the last 10 years. But it's just going to be a long-term process. It's like what everything from a systems management perspective they went through 10 years ago, automating from like a chef and puppet perspective. We need to do the same things with network, except it's going to be probably a worse fight, just because it's a little bit different in how it's approached.
Yeah, and I'd imagine most enterprise aren't just going to go out and say, cool, I'll take 10 white boxes and I'm going to program them, and that's totally kosher. Compliance is cool with it. Procurement's happy, because he's missing his steak dinners because he's not buying something else. So. That can all tie into it. Scott, I'm curious, if someone were to come up to you, I imagine they do quite often, and just say, what the heck is software-defined networking? How would you define that? What's your answer to them? How do you kind of kick off that conversation with a meaningful answer?
Well, I think because of what others have pointed out, in that every vendor has now come along and said, bam, it's SDN now, right? It's got an API,
software and a hardware somewhere.
Bam. It's got a new whatever. I mean, it's really, really confusing. And so what I personally do, and others may disagree, and that's fine. I think what I personally do is go back to kind of the original definition from Nick McCown and the others at Stanford when they were creating OpenFlow, and the very first use of the term software-defined networking, which was actually separating the control plane, which is that piece that affects how traffic moves through the network, from the data plane, which is what's responsible for actually moving the traffic to the network. Now, that's, in many people's eyes, that's an old school definition, and it's not broad enough to actually define
So you're already
SDN.
old school on SDN, and it's not even pervasive.
But I mean, I think if we go back to that, then that in and of itself enables all the other things that are happening, right? Orchestration becomes suddenly now much easier because we've separated that control plane, which is responsible for helping perform that orchestration. APIs become easier, right? I'm not saying that they're required necessarily, because you could do APIs on a switch without a controller. Lots of companies do it, but does it really help? Does it really solve the problem? I mean, an API is really just another CLI.
What if I were to come and say, Scott, we already have the distributed switch in vSphere. That's a separated control plane and data plane, so that's software-defined networking.
I would say that's true, but the problem is then we're slapping SDN on something that existed a couple years ago.
Okay,
So
that's not cool, yeah. Go ahead, Joe.
Scott and I's methodologies, where our companies come from, what we do, are completely different. But I think that where that conversation needs to go is you need to step back. As technologists, we get so wrapped up into what's this feature, what's this product, what's this next squirrel we're going to go chase. Step back and figure out what's your problem, what does the business need, what are you trying to do? It's the service, it's the application, it's the user experience, it's the risk, it's the compliance, it's governance, it's whatever it is. Step back from that and figure out what are the best set of tools to run for that. And in some cases, it's going to be Scott's. In some cases, it's going to be Lisa's. In some cases, it's going to be mine. In some cases, it's going to be none of ours. But the idea is, if you don't know what the end goal of what your CIO and CTO need to deliver to the business, then you're never going to get the network right, period.
I mean, I agree. And I think the other thing, as technologists, we often get wrapped up in the technologies, especially in the networking space. It's all about protocols and formats and all this kind of jazz. And there are reasons why, and that's fine, right? But I agree with Joe that we need to take a step back and stop looking at SDN as like the goal, because SDN is a tool to help us get to that goal. It's something to help us accomplish some sort of IT outcome. Reduced CapEx, reduced OpEx, greater security, better compliance, something along those lines. Like there's a goal. We're not just deploying SDN because we think it's cool. I mean, if you are, that's great. Lucky for you that you have a job that you can do that, right? But the reality is most of the rest of us are saying we have a problem and we're trying to fix that problem. SDN is one tool among a whole toolbox of pieces that you can deploy to actually solve the problem.
I think the problem, though, is that most of the people that we are trying to talk to about SDN and educate are not the 50,000-foot overview, how is this going to help my business people? Because those people, you could tell them that SDN is a white unicorn riding through the quad downstairs.
That's how I sell it.
Cue the unicorn mask for Tom.
But, well, actually, I have it with me. But the junior admins, or even the senior admins who are sitting down in the trenches every day pulling cables and moving switches, if you go to him and you say, all right, well, I need this VM in New York City to talk to this VM in Los Angeles and vMotion over the same network, they don't think, what's the business case for this? Or how am I going to implement this from a compliancy perspective? They're thinking OSPF, layer 2 data center interconnects. They're immediately focused on the technical challenge to the problem. And then when they make it work and someone comes along from the security department and says, oh, hey, by the way, that link needs to be encrypted, otherwise all that data is going to be out in the wild and you're going to get fired, they go, I just got it working.
That's my favorite mistake with SDN is we get so focused on this concept that we end up thinking that layer 7 is going to ride magical unicorns across the data center to get where it needs to go. There's still a layer 1 through 6 that needs to happen underneath no matter what it is you're doing with SDN.
Well, that's a really good point, though, talking about folks that are in the trenches, folks that are doing the work. From a server perspective to a network perspective, the whole gamut. I'm curious, kind of open to the panel, what changes when we start implementing this SDN tool operationally? How does my day-to-day role as a server person, virtualization person, network person, whatever you want to talk about, change when we start adding this SDN unicorn that keeps getting brought up on this panel?
Well, I mean,
there we go, I got a victim here.
We're all, regardless of what role you're in IT, whether you're a networking person, whether you're a server person, whether you're a security person, the lines between those roles continue to blur every single day, right? And we've all kind of known it was coming. I mean, I remember sitting in Las Vegas having a chat with a bunch of folks, and we were talking about, are the silos going to go away? And I'm like, oh, maybe they'll never go away, but the walls get thinner every day, right? You get more and more people who, regardless of what product or solution or technology you're going to use, your server guys are going to be more involved in networking. Your networking team is going to be more involved in virtualization. Your security team is going to be more involved in all of it. You've got cloud infrastructure teams and cloud management teams. And
does the audience agree? Do you feel like your role is expanding beyond what you were initially hired to do, or beyond your title into other silos? Raise a hand. Anybody that feels okay? So pretty much everybody.
And there's always going to be the junior level folks who will pull in the cable, and that's fine. But for those of us who aren't the junior level folks, we have to start thinking beyond just the obvious. Like when we're presented a problem, one of the things with IT is that we don't think about the business problem. We just go implement a solution and like, okay, here's your solution to do blah, blah, whatever it was. And the business is like, that doesn't even do what I needed it to do. You went off and built something in an ivory tower. You didn't consult us. We have to move past just thinking about technology and thinking about how technology solves the business problem. Because if we don't, we as individuals are going to become obsolete and our companies aren't going to survive, in my opinion.
If your job is to deliver IT services to a business today, you are the best place in the world, because we're transitioning from 10 years of IT needs to save more cost and save more cost and save more cost to IT needs to deliver new things and differentiate me, serve the mission, serve the purpose. You're in a place where we're finally getting back to the point that IT differentiates what we can do as businesses, and SDN, all these other things that we're looking around is what's are tools to drive that.
Wish I had like a magic 8-ball that just said the things that come out of your mouth. Just like, what's SDN?
We can make an app
serve the mission.
Yeah, but I mean, just kind of going off of Scott and Joe's points on that, I think for most of us where you get in such a cost-driven environment that there's less and less teams. It's more of like we got like 3 guys now that can kind of support anything. So I mean, we need the tools. We need.
You're the person that handles things to get plugged in. You're the person that. Oh wait, we don't have anyone else.
Yeah, I mean, I work in a lot of environments where there is only a handful of people where they support pretty much everything, and if it breaks, it's IT's fault. So I mean, we need
the network's fault if things break. So.
Network's always wrong first.
Yeah.
If you look at a lot of the research that's been done about sort of why SDN and why do you care and all of that, user polls keep coming back with sort of the illities. I hope it will. I think or hope it's going to save me money, or it's going to make me more agile or whatever. And I don't know how much of that is self-generated belief and how much of that is people have consumed and internalized what I'm going to say these guys have been talking about.
Thanks.
Fingers have been pointed.
No finger pointing.
I think that's what you use to justify the project, and maybe that's where you get started with, and maybe that's sort of what you use to kind of prove the case and kind of keep going from there. But what we started with was let's make our network more programmable so that we can go and do stuff that we want to do on our own without waiting for the next product refresh cycle. So if all you're focused on is the ilities, you might as well just get a better network management system, right? What you're really trying to get to is this other thing over here, which is I want to be able to make my network mine. I want to be able to monkey around with it, to create features that are just mine, or maybe I want to make them, share them with the rest of the world, whatever it is. And if you need to start here to justify it, that's great, but don't forget about the end goal. The end goal is really to get to a point where you can actually do what you want to do with your network. And by the way, and this is again where open source comes in, haha. We've kind of already gone through this with the server world, right, with Linux and getting people a little bit comfortable with bringing open source into the compute environment. Bringing networking along as well kind of further adds to the process where talent acquisition is very different from what HR is accustomed to dealing with because you don't own the people who are necessarily creating the features you're asking for. The purchase process is very different. You're not getting a box. No purchasing person can check that off the list and say, okay, yes, that matches the specs because it's changing all the time. All of these different back-end processes that tend to be very set in stone in most organizations, they're not built for this new world. And this is a tool for fixing that. It's not just a tool for fixing IT. It's a tool for fixing back-end processes kind of across the board.
I think you guys, well, most of you in the audience are server admins, right? Virtual server admins. You've already been
Don't
through...
say that like it's a bad thing. We'll throw something at you.
all of you guys, guys and gals. You people have already been through this shift. And where you come into play is everyone in here at some point probably started as a rack or stacker, right? Here's a box, make it fit in that rack and plug in all the cables. The world needs ditch diggers too. You're never going to get away from that.
Wow. Keep going, Tom.
He just called you all ditch diggers.
I'm loving this.
But I'm not talking to
scoot away from Tom a little bit.
I'm not talking to these people because you all are administrators of virtual systems of greater than 5 servers, right? Or in some cases, several more than 5 servers. But you are a force multiplier. So you apply the tools that VMware and other organizations give you to manage not 5 physical boxes or 10 physical boxes, but like 2 physical boxes that contain an infinite amount of servers, right? Your knowledge is no longer at that mid-tier where you're managing 4 servers. You're managing a lot more than that. And the challenges didn't go away. Some of them did. Obviously, I don't have to worry about keeping track of 4 different servers that have this network card and that video card and all these other things. That doesn't matter to you anymore. You have different challenges, CPU reservations and vkernel ports and things like that. The mid-tier of networking is going away. You are being replaced by a shell script, essentially. You're always going to need ditch diggers to go move the switches and change the ports, and this is where you plug that in. And then the people who are in the mid-tier and the higher tier now have to retrain themselves to use the tools that we're giving them to orchestrate, automate, program networks. There's no comfortable hiding spot anymore. You can't just say, oh, hey, I know Cisco CLI and I've got this little thing that I copy and paste into the switch and I change these 3 values and everything comes up. I'm going to draw my thousands of dollars a year. Nope, I don't need you anymore.
But I think the most important thing there is that there's no job role in the data center that's going away. And the people here, because you're here to attend VMworld, you're already the most adaptive people in IT. The MCSE became the VMware admin and their paycheck went up, their value went up. And then they moved up the stack. And now they're the cloud orchestration, they're the cloud automation people. You're already the ones that are here to change. The problem I have with SDN and the problem I'll see with SDN is that my network engineers haven't had to change for 30 years. They're going to be, question?
Cisco account rep quite a few times is, you guys want to
I actually answer that really easily.
Well, let's repeat the question for the recording. Essentially,
okay, so
we've got a gentleman that is wearing multiple hats already, looking towards selling SDN higher up the stack, essentially. That VMware was an easy sell because you're turning 28 servers into 3. There's an easy cost savings model there, but how do you do the same kind of with
you're
SDN?
talking about selling it into a smaller environment, not a service provider, not a 10,000 node enterprise massive organization. Got a question. Do you work for a VAR? Okay. I used to work for a VAR, and I used to work for a VAR that specialized in K through 12 education. You want to talk about a group of people that didn't have any money at all? I'm telling you.
Yeah, the people educating our kids, no money.
No, we've seriously considered having bake sales to buy networking equipment. It used to be a joke with me. But they have the challenges that enterprise-grade networks do on small business budgets. For instance, every year in April, Oklahoma does online testing for all of their schools. They don't do the little Scantron bubble thing anymore. You want to know what happens when 500 laptops hit a 10 meg internet connection all at once?
Unicorns?
And some kid is downloading a file via FTP? I can tell you it's a lot of panicked phone calls. What does SDN do for me there? Well, SDN allows me to network slice the section that state testing is using, guarantee a specific amount of bandwidth for those users so that state testing doesn't break, but the kids who are downloading the latest EverQuest update are going to fail. And I can sell that to you as a real, actual service. Why? Because if anybody in this room has ever tried to configure QoS through a network without automation, you probably look like I do. Because QoS is one of the hardest damn things in the world to configure. As a matter of fact, go out today and download any paper from anyone talking about SDN for applications, and I challenge you to find a paper that doesn't mention Microsoft Link. You know why? Because Link is an unruly application that does not respect any kind of network policies. SDN for Link is essentially making Link behave with the way you set your network up. That's where SDN is being sold. SDN is being sold as a service to give you the capabilities to do things you've wanted to do for years, but you couldn't find the people to punch the keys fast enough to make it happen. Now, the challenge for you is to make that appealing in a way that you can resell it as a service. Because, yeah, you're never going to need to order one of Joe's kits for a school that has 70 kids.
Yes, you will.
Please make the PO out.
I think Joe just committed to getting the 9,000 approved for E-rate. but you've got to approach it not as a hardware problem or not as a software problem, but as a methodology. It's not it's not a box that says SDN that you can just kind of shove in front of the customer and say, oh, your problems are solved. You've got to take the MacGyver approach, is I've got this piece and that piece and this piece, and I've got to make all of them work to come up with an outcome. But unlike MacGyver, you may actually have to support it 43 minutes after
it doesn't explode.
Well, I got one last comment, then I got to walk off stage because I got somewhere.
Yeah, we're going to kick them off in a few minutes.
What I would say is your biggest problem right now is that as vendors, we're making a big mistake, and I am one of the biggest trolls on Twitter. So if you follow me on Twitter, I am a big part of this problem.
I think we'd all agree.
We spend more time. we spend more time, and I create more time, fighting what each other do wrong and what is the right way and what is the this and that. And the same way cloud happened 10 years ago, 7 years ago, whatever it was. Instead of telling you what we can do for you and the rest, so you go to the independents, you go to the channel partners, you go to these people, have a conversation with somebody that knows both sides and doesn't have a stake in which product gets sold you on the back end. And I think that'd probably be your best bet when you're trying to understand this and when you're trying to sell it back up your chain.
In that case, please talk to Ryan at Precision.
I mean, the key really is, this is what we mentioned earlier, the key really is to stop looking at the technology and look at the business problem, right? You were able to justify using vSphere to do consolidation because there was a business problem you were solving, right? You can't take SDN or network automation or cloud orchestration or any of those technologies and get a win in the business without saying this is the business problem it solves. Now, Joe did actually Tom, I'm sorry, did a great job of giving you an example of a business problem for a school that SDN is a tool that could solve, right? Is it the only tool? No, it's a good tool. But for you and your organization, and this applies to everyone in here, if you're looking at SDN and saying, well, what do I do with it? The trick is you got to say, what is the problem I'm trying to solve? And then what are the tools? Is SDN one of the tools that I use? Is it network virtualization? Is it open source? Is it some combination of these things? Is it white box switching? Whatever. how do I solve the business problem, then you can assemble the right collection of technologies and tools to actually do that.
And I was going to say, off of Scott's point there, I think initially we all moved to vSphere to consolidate, but we realized over time it was much easier to manage applications on vSphere than it was just on bare metal hardware in a lot of cases. It's the same problem with networking. I mean, today, if you have a problem in your network, how many different devices do you have to log into to remediate the problem? If you're even able to identify that.
Yeah, that's all.
I mean, I think realistically, that's the biggest benefit I see from an SDN that we don't talk about is the application visibility. I mean, you look at all the tools that are out there, it's the same problem we dealt with servers years ago. We realized that we had all these different, mechanisms to look, health and stuff like that. But once we virtualized it and we nominalized what everything looked like from a workload perspective, it became much easier for us to troubleshoot it. I think we have the same potential with networking because it is, right now when you deal with the larger customers that are, looking at SDN, look at how much money they spend on network management tools today. It's a lot.
Yeah, I didn't want to make this too much about any particular product, but since we are at VMworld and we have Scott here, I'm curious from an NSX perspective, could you offer some input around? Sorry. Awesome.
The audience is now awake.
That must have been the hardware to find something or other. Some input around actual use cases that are being solved, at a high level with NSX, kind of maybe to your point, but also to anyone else that may be thinking, what am I going to use NSX to do? So far, it's just these 3 letters.
Right. So one of the leading use cases that has emerged for NSX is this idea of microsegmentation. And that is the ability to be very, very granular with the level of security that you're applying in the data center. Lots of companies want to move to the so-called zero trust model where everything is assumed to be bad, right? We don't trust anyone, we don't trust anything, we don't trust any source. And so we want to make sure that everything is walled off. Not even the internal users of the company are considered trusted sources. So this idea of having a zero trust model and being able to say it's not just about having a perimeter firewall, but it's about having a firewall basically at every VM, which was something you could do before, but just the operational overhead.
You mean the Windows firewall that we all turn off?
Right, yeah, exactly. The operational overhead of doing that is just so massive, but now looking at kind of centralizing the control point, the central policy for that, and then being able to distribute the enforcement out among all these machines is really resonating with a lot of customers. So we're seeing a lot of interest from that. Obviously, there are some very, very large customers, service providers, and cloud providers, and all that who are also adopting NSX, but they're looking at multi-tenancy and sort of isolation as their key drivers.
Sure.
Down in the enterprise, down market, microsegmentation has been a big one, and I'm sure that we're going to see other use cases emerge, but that's one of the leading ones right now.
I heard Scott say the P word, policy. That's the future.
Is that
of
a
where
dirty
this
word?
is going.
Or?
No, it's a good word, and people need to say more about it.
Yeah.
Okay. I always go back. So I went to school to be an MIS major. For those of you who don't know, that's basically DBA, and look at me now. But I think about languages like SQL. SQL is a perfect example of a high-order language that's used to craft a policy to get something out of a database in this case. Select star from users where clue greater than 0. No rows returned. So you're basically telling the server, I want you to go into this database and find this value, right? You're crafting a policy to create an outcome. In networking, that's stupid hard to do now. I want to create an application that lives in a DMZ that's able to communicate with a back-end infrastructure. I want you to make it happen so that all of that is secure along the way. Well, now I have to remember to go to that firewall and this policy, and I need to know these ports, and most people give up, and they just say, forget it. If the policy is smart enough to understand that whenever you are requesting application of type email server between server A and server B, open these 7 ports on the firewall from this IP to that IP, and only during these time periods, that's the force multiplier for you guys. But that means you're going to have to relearn a policy language, whether it be Congress or OpFlex or whatever the next iteration happens to be.
Some fun little open source name.
Yeah, exactly. Or what are we on now? Are we on like counties in Wyoming or something?
It's like finding space aliens now when I hear these new project names.
Yeah.
So it's like
you've got to understand that we've created these powerful tools and we've created API abstracts to interface with them. But in order for you to operate those API abstracts, what you've known in the past as a CLI, show IP route, that doesn't exist anymore. Now you have to find an interface that you can use to interact with these constructs, mostly so we can keep you from shooting your own foot off.
That's a good advice. So final thoughts, I'd like to start with you, Lisa, and we'll kind of work our way down. Any kind of places people should be looking, things and skills people should be adopting as we kind of move out of this talk on networking from open source to products to whatever you might want to talk about, if you give us a minute or two on that.
Sure. One of the things that kind of concerns me is there's sort of a lot of talk of, oh my God, do networking people have to become programmers? Okay. Can it hurt? Probably not. If as an industry we make it so that everybody does have to, we fail. We fail. That should not have to happen. It can't ever hurt to know what's going on behind the scenes, and there's probably going to be some interstitial period where, in order to be able to really jump on the SDN train, you might have to learn some Python and some other types of scripting languages, just waiting for the GUIs to catch up. But those are coming; they're coming fast, and it's, I think, more important to not get hung up on the what do I have to do, technically, what do I have to learn technically in order to ride this train, and more about where is it going to take me, and be able to think creatively along those lines.
When you said the GUIs are coming, I kind of had like a historical moment, like the GUIs are coming, the GUIs are coming. Tom, final thoughts.
I look back at the transition from telecom to voice over IP, and I look at a lot of telecom engineers that kind of got thrown out on an island because, you know what, hey, we don't need you anymore. And then, years later we go, hey, these guys may have actually known something. You guys as server admins, go hug your network admin. Maybe it's a little bit of hug. Find out what they know. These guys have spent careers figuring out how networking works. They know all the traps, they know all the tricks. Get those teams talking to each other so that when changes come down the line, no matter what form they come in, when the network becomes an abstraction, when we have to program it through APIs and GUIs and things like that, that knowledge isn't lost. Because if that knowledge gets lost, we're eventually going to get into this kind of strange, weird thing where you've got this one guy who sits in a closet all the time because he's the only one who knows that when he types this magical command into the software, magic packets happen on the other end. You can't have that happen. If you do, you've failed.
Is that the same guy with the red swing line stapler you're talking about?
No, this guy wears a robe and he prays to the keyboard every morning.
Okay, sandals and the long beard. Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Brian, hit us up.
Kind of going off of Lisa's thought, I think there's an inverse of that problem. I think any of us who have worked in the industry long enough realize that any of the really smart people, whether it be on the system side or on the networking side, most of those people do have somewhat of a developer programming background anyways, because quite frankly, you can't get through a large deployment and not at some point script out or at least look at a higher level approach to doing all that work. Otherwise, it would just be brutal.
Does that sound fair? You need some kind of scripting to do large deployment work?
I'm not saying you got to be a full-time developer, working with Java. But I think as an industry, the things that we can do now today are much better than where we were 10 years ago. If you look at, like developer, the concept of like a developer sandbox or something where it's interactive, of where we can kind of get in there and generate pseudocode, is going to help us actually do some of this work. And that's where we need to be focused on from an industry standpoint, rather than just saying, well, I need to learn Python 101 and start from scratch. I think we're way past that point, but I think we just need to give ourselves a little bit more credit and realize that the really smart people have been doing this for years. We just need to give them better tools so that they can show everyone else that they've been doing it.
Kind of like beard and sandals are optional.
Oh, definitely.
But encouraged. and last but certainly not least, Scott, please.
So, I think we all recognize that we're in a period where things are massively changing. There's a lot of flux in the industry, in our careers, in our organizations. We talked about all the forces that are coming from all these different directions. And the advice that I give, I speak at a lot of VMUGs, advice that I give people, I talk to VMware admins there, and I'm like, okay, how do I keep up? What do I need to do? Really it all boils down to you need to be ready and open for change. None of us are ever going to sit stagnant in our career. If you are, then you're going to be left behind. And so when it comes to things like, if you're a server guy or a gal, you need to know about the networking side. If you're a networking guy or gal, you need to know about the server side. Everybody needs to know some open source. I've been telling people, hey, Linux. To go to your point, Chris, Linux is coming. Linux, right? You need to be familiar with that, right? Because it's everywhere. It's touching everything in our lives. Open source is becoming so prevalent, and so these are the things that are going to make us as IT professionals more effective. We can't get locked into our own little view of looking at it. We have to take a broader view. We have to be sure to looking at what are the business problems we're trying to solve. It's not just about our little piece of the IT infrastructure anymore. It's about how do we take our entire group and our entire company forward, be ready for change, be ready to embrace change, and just get out there and have fun with it. I mean, there's a lot of cool stuff happening, right? And I know all of us like to, like to look on the cool stuff. There's a lot of cool stuff out there. Go out there and look at it. Take it apart, learn from it, see what applies to the business problems in your organization, and put it to work for you.
That's fair enough. I know I had one script that I wrote recently that just turned all the LEDs on our Cisco UCS in the lab, just on and off. I'm like, I kept just on, off, like, that's so cool.
All right.
Yeah, and then I just cycled it. I'm like, well, that's just going to do that for a while because I can't stop watching it. So that's exactly what he meant, was that. All right. Well, thank you very much to the panelists, and thank you all for listening into this panel.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.